What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today, Bryan and myself are going to get into some kind of larger questions and thoughts that we have been having around training, largely dictated by some recent doubts or playing of devil's advocate, I could say, in my own training and thoughts around that. And I think it's going to provide a really interesting and thought-provoking conversation, and I'm really excited to lean on Bryan for some of his wisdom there. But before we get into this, Bryan, let's cover some updates. How you doing?
Yeah, man, doing well here. I think our conversation today could almost be framed as like, how important is the nuance or something like that? We'll figure out exactly how to title it, but I think that that's a good approach. We'll see how it sounds at the end of the episode. But anyway, updates here. All is pretty good in my world. I think the last time we spoke last week, I had just hit like a new low, or I was close to a new low. I think I was in the 184s or something like that for my body weight, and I was like way ahead of schedule since my deadline here is June 30th. And then I went on vacation these last few days with my family. So we took a trip up to a place called Grand Lake in Colorado, which is this beautiful, majestic lake, really cute town. And I just decided during that time that I was going to give myself a little leeway. I hadn't taken a refeed. Did I talk about my refeed thing last episode at all?
I don't, not that I remember.
Okay. So I have not taken a refeed this entire diet until this vacation. It had been over 9 weeks or right around 9 weeks or something of me staying within 300 calories of my targets throughout the entire diet. So it was like, a month at 3,100 calorie average, and then a month at, or 3 weeks at 2,800 calories, and then 3 weeks at 2,600 calories or something like that. And I never deviated more than 300 calories up or down from that number. So that's the first year that I've actually done a diet where I haven't had these like kind of structured periods of, today I'm going to have 3,700 calories, and then oh, fuck, well, the next few days I need to go 2,200 or something along those lines. So this much more like linear approach for me, where I just kind of could put my head down and just eat the same shit day after day and not think about it. That's been like a dream for me, and also makes the scale much more predictable, which was great for me as well. And despite that predictability, you would still see it up or down 2 pounds either direction, for really no reason. So it just goes to show that when you do things like refeeds and then you cut and then refeeds and deficit, and you kind of balance it out in that way, there would be even more fluctuations. So I just thought that was like an interesting point, but it leads me into kind of these 3 days that we had on vacation in Grand Lake. And the first day I knew I was going to just eat food because I'd been hungry. I'd hit a new low, all this stuff. So I estimated it at around 3,200 calories. It could have been more than that. I do tend to err on the side of estimating too high when I go out to eat, because I think that's a smart move. It's possible that even despite that I didn't estimate high enough. For example, they served me a big plate of French fries, and my initial intention was to eat what I would consider is 10 grams of fat of French fries, which would be 20 to 25 carbs or so, which was literally probably 10 fries or less. I ended up having like 30 fries. So I counted it as like 30 fat and 65 carb or something like that. And who knows, like that could have been too low. But I kind of followed that same idea of tracking throughout the rest of the weekend. I did not eat 3,200 calories the other 2 days. I estimated it at 2,500 and 2,800. Because I followed more of like an intermittent fasting approach, which is kind of what I tend to do when I'm on vacation, so that I can have like a more enjoyable lunch and dinner with the fam. So I did that, and as far as I know, I think I did a pretty good job and was pretty accurate. But these last 2 days getting back here, the scale was 185.8, and then this morning before the show it was 186.4. So we're about 2 pounds above my low for the diet, not my weekly average for the diet, but the lowest point that I'm about 2 pounds above that, which is still kind of within the range of like natural fluctuations, even despite going on this 3-day vacation. But ultimately, like, I know there's variability. There's things I don't know about exactly what I put in my body, how much sodium I had, a number of kind of factors that go into that. So I still don't exactly know how it's going to play out, once the scale kind of finds its homeostasis again. But the last 2 days, I've controlled what I could control since we've been back, and I had 2,400 calories and 2,500 calories. So I feel like I'm doing what I should be doing, and I'm still on track to get to the 182 or the low 180s by the end of June. So everything's on track there, and then we can jump back to me for some additional updates here. But any thoughts on that, or you want to update everyone on what's going on with you?
Yeah. So I think that ultimately, and this is going to sound like super, super basic, but when you control things that like you control, Bryan, when you're as regimented as you are, like small deviations like this, it's the worst case scenario is really just time and resources, right? Your diet might end 7 to 9 days later than it was originally planned to, sort of thing. But other than that, it's like, it's really water under the bridge. And that's like the beauty of it. And what I really like that you said is you're taking like a little bit of a different approach. Like I'm just eating the same thing day in and day out, making it easy for me. I'm not like taking pure like structured refeeds and that sort of thing. And that's the exact way that I always diet. I just try and simplify things so that I can just like copy pasta, my chronometer, and I know it's going to work. And then one just little aside, I will generally leverage refeeds with clientele when biofeedback warrants it as opposed to a plan. There's sometimes like I have a client, we are encroaching upon 10% total body fat loss. Sorry, not 10% total, 10% total body mass loss. We're going to take a 1 to 2 week like diet break and like scheduled refeed at maintenance just because it's been like 20 weeks, 22 weeks of dieting or something like that. Like that's a big one. But generally people aren't crossing that large of a threshold. I leverage biofeedback, like when stress is really, really high or something like that. I'm like, okay, we're going to benefit from this greatly, as opposed to saying like, hey, 5 weeks refeed type thing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think obviously the leaner you get, the more important things like that are, because biofeedback gets worse. But I think for me, like I tried to do that, or I acted like I was doing that in prior diets where I'd be like, no refeeds for the first month. So it's like I'm eating 3,100 calories a day and losing weight. And it's like, of course I don't need a refeed, right? But then as soon as my calories dropped down to 2,800 in prior years, I would be like, well, there's all these foods I don't want to, or I can't eat now that I really want. I'm 6 weeks into the diet. Like I should totally have a refeed. So then I go have like this 3,700 calorie day where I get to have these tastes of these foods that I really like. And it almost like spikes the appetite, And then you're like, well, since I had 3,700 calories today, now for the next 3 days, I have to have like 2,200. And it really feels just like this whiplash effect that's awful, because you go from this super palatable food day to 3 days of not. And it's kind of depressing and demotivating. So just being like, hey, if I have 2,800 every day, then I could have little bites here and there of things that I want, like a bite of the bagel or like, things like that. And that for me, like, that's fine. Like, I don't need, to go have like 6 pieces of cake. I can just have like 1 bite of the kid's cake as I'm handing it to them and track that and be happy with that. But at 2,200 calories, you can't do that. So it's just like this more moderate approach where every day is kind of like a replica of the prior day until biofeedback warrants it. I think that that's going to be my approach moving forward.
Yep, I agree completely. So kind of jumping over to my updates, I'll start on the back end. I'm officially into my diet. So I talked about last week, started with Alex Bush on physique development, and I'm going into dieting really just because it's easier from a food sourcing standpoint to eat less. It's really, really hot and humid here. We talked about that a little bit too. And then leading into some of the kind of later parts of our discussion, the interesting thing around when you get lean, or I should say like when we, the collective we, get lean, it becomes a little bit easier to objectively measure things, especially when comparing your physique, right? So when you're trying to say like, well, do I have more muscle than I did last year? When you're at like 13, 14 to 15% body fat, it's kind of hard because no one looks fantastic at 15% body fat because you have a fair degree of body fat covering it. But when you get down to that, like, how I know I can really tell with me personally is when some of the ab veins start coming in. That lets me know I'm at like probably just under 10% body fat. Everyone is going to carry their Fat pattern storaging a little bit different. Some people might get, veins in their abs at like 11%, but then they still have, a lot of water or fat left in their quads or different things. But I just know for me, that is about where that comes in. So it's going to help me there too. So that's one thing. I'm excited about it. It's just like, I want to be careful choosing my words because dieting is generally inherently considered unhealthy unless, let's say, you're coming from like a 35% body fat or something like that, where just being that heavy and overweight is much more unhealthy than the process of getting leaner. But I like to throw around the term around 15%. Less than 15 for a male, less than 15% body fat for a male. I'm not convinced that getting leaner objectively improves health much. So I want to kind of point that out. But what I like personally is like, in order to facilitate the fat loss going from like a 13, a 12%, 13% where I'm starting to like that 9-ish where I generally will end, I have to eat really, really healthy foods. Like I really have to clean up my diet. I eat a lot of vegetables. Like I'm talking like 600, 700, 800 grams of vegetables per day. So to me, it's like I'm like incorporating more healthy habits just because I really don't have margins in order to not do so. So I do enjoy that as well, because it's like I get different and improved micronutrient diversity of my diet because I'm eating a lot more vegetables, more berries and stuff like that. And I really do enjoy that aspect of it. So I'm pumped about that's like fully underway. And things are moving swimmingly. I started at 195 last Monday, and today I was like 191.8. So it works.
When you got that DEXA a few months ago, you came back at like 8.2%, and your body weight was what, like 192 or something?
Don't remind me. Yeah, that was like, it's like kind of something that leads into this episode. When I got the 2 DEXAs ago, when I wrapped up my recovery diet in early November in Salt Lake, it was 8.2% body fat, and I was 191 point something or 192 point something. So it's a little disheartening because I weigh that pretty much now and I don't look nearly like I did then. So it really just, and I've talked about this on the podcast, I just had a shitty, winter of training and prioritizing it really. And it does kind of suck to know like, yeah, I'm fatter and have less muscle, like 100% confident in that statement.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, so the reason that I brought that up was actually not to make you feel bad, but to make you feel good. Because so I was listening to this podcast. Do you know a guy named Peter Attia?
I do, actually.
He's an MD, but super smart guy as well.
Yep.
So I subscribed to his podcast recently at the urging of Dave McConey. And so I was looking through, for certain guests that I recognized and thought might be interesting. And he has a 2-part series with Layne Norton where each one is between 2.5 and 3 hours. And so I started listening to them. And there's just like gems of information throughout, like a lot of stuff that I already know and is pretty basic. But, anytime you listen to Layne talk for 6 hours, you learn something. And so one of the things he was saying that I thought was wild is that DEXAs generally run about 3 or 4% higher than almost every other method of body fat detection. So he said that most bodybuilding competitors that stand on stage, like natural bodybuilders who are, shredded glutes, are like 5 or 6% on a DEXA. So my first thought literally when I heard that was, oh my God, Aaron was like 4 pounds away from stage weight. So to me, that's insane. Because if you're measuring 8.2% on a DEXA and Layne Norton's talking about standing on stage at 5 or 6%, then you're literally looking at, okay, maybe you lose a little bit of muscle along the way, but you're looking at standing on stage in like the low to mid 180s. Which is crazy. That's really, really large.
Yeah, it was. I've talked about this. Like we talked about it last week, where like that gym anxiety. I was in the best shape of my life, like last summer and fall. Like things were just working. And the thing that was really interesting too is I had two DEXAs at that location. So I did one like the day the diet ended, like, July or August 1st or whatever. And that was like an 8.8. And I went in, a few months later after reversing, my food up, and was even leaner. And like I looked really, I was in pretty damn good shape. And my coach, Jason Theobald at the time, he told me multiple times, he's like, you're literally, we peak week and you step on stage. Like you're 5 days away from getting on stage. Like, let's just do it. And I was like, no, I don't know how to pose. I don't know fuck all. Like, no. But yeah, I was, and it was great. But then it also kind of like, now I'm like, well, fuck. It was sweet then.
Yeah,
and
but
now
you
it
like
kind of
basically
sucks.
live at a very lean state. Like if 191 is 8% body fat, and that would make your stage weight, we'll call it low to mid 180s, and you're walking around most time at low to mid 190s. So like you're 10 pounds above stage weight, just like walking around daily life for the most part.
Potentially like a what is it, men's physique or something like that, like men's natural bodybuilding, no way.
I don't know, dude. If Lane's right, then you're 2% on a Dexa away from being on stage in
Yeah,
that picture, that picture in the fall.
yeah, and that's like, as silly as it sounds, like these are the things, well, these are one of the handful of things that excite me to like stop traveling, because I want to like consistently go to a DEXA scan place. I want to get like, I just want to do more experiments on myself, and the type of lifestyle I live right now just is not conducive for it. Especially things like this, like having a productive off season of training. Like I literally lived in Salt Lake City, two different spots in Arizona, was in Virginia, and now here in Indonesia. It's just like, it throws wrenches in your plans. It really does. As
For
fun as it
sure.
is, trade-offs, really.
Yep. Yep. Cool. Well, should I do some training updates real quick? All right, cool. Well, I'm now somehow in the middle of my fourth microcycle of my hypertrophy. So that happened really fast. I remember a few episodes complaining about how I was so tired of the metabolic work and just so ready for it to end. And now we're 4 weeks in. So the cool part about kind of the way I progress things and getting to microcycle 4 is that now I'm using partials and reverse drop sets on almost all short overload movements at this point. So that's super cool, because there's something about instituting those techniques that just make me feel like I'm getting the most that I can out of these kind of non-fatiguing movements that are short overloaded. And so I've really been enjoying it. For the first time just yesterday, I did a reverse drop set on a pull around. So this is where the lat is lengthened across the body. So the arm comes across the body, lengthens the lat. So I essentially went to 2 reps from failure, which is the way you do a buy-in set usually for these reverse drop sets. And then quick weight change where you add 20% load. So in this case, I went from 170 for 8 reps to 200 for my reverse drop set. And then I got 6 reps of lengthened partials at 200 pounds, where it was mostly focusing on that stretch position of the lat as that arm is coming across the body. So that was the first time I've ever done a reverse drop set on a pull around style movement. And I'm a huge fan. It was awesome. I enjoy that type of nuance, which is some of the stuff we're going to talk about today as we get into our topic. But that was super cool. And then one of the other kind of things that we'll also talk about as we get into some of the earlier topics too is progressing, how to progress some movements different than others. So for like lengthened overload movements or movements that aren't very obviously short overloaded, I tend to use a rest pause set as a progression method instead of, because you can't really do partials on a movement that doesn't fail short. So I'm also into a rest pause set for, oh man, I think it's just chest movements at the moment. I did it for 2 chest movements yesterday. And then I think I do it for the overhead tricep extension, the cross cable, and the face away curls at the end of the week. So I'm starting to gradually introduce some of those too. Nowhere near at the point where I'm going to introduce a rest pause set for like my big squatting and hip hinging movements. But I did get to do a reverse drop set on my hip extension, the 45-degree hip extension. And so same idea as what I did on the pull around, where I did 7 full reps, full range of motion with 75 pounds per hand. And then I switched out the 75s, grabbed the hundreds, and got 6 partial reps, just kind of working that bottom position. And the man himself, Mr. Kassem, saw me doing that on my story and suggested that I consider doing the reverse drop set portion of that sequence with a lengthened RDL, stiff-legged deadlift type movement, instead of with the hip extension, mostly because he said that transition looked really painful. And it kind of was. Like I had the 75s, you know, I had to put the 75s down, walk over, move the 75s, put the hundreds in, get back in the machine, pick the hundreds up type thing. And he was basically like, so my statement back to him was, you know, when I go really heavy on hip hinges, I tend to pull my QL more often than I would like. And he was like, yeah, but because this is the second part of the superset, you know, you actually wouldn't even need to go super heavy to do kind of these lengthened partials of a hip hinge. And so I get that. I actually think it makes good sense. And I think that it's something I'm going to think over and possibly institute for my next mesocycle. But I'm going to continue at least for the next 2 or 3 weeks until this mesocycle ends. I'm going to continue with the 45-degree hip extension thing. And just because I'm not a huge fan of changing and diagnostics, and then, you know, having to, like, if I'm already in week 4, then you would think that I would be pushing my lengthened partials to like this close to failure RIR type thing. And I wouldn't want to do that jumping in fresh to like a hip hinge lengthened partial, which is actually something I've never done before. So something I'm going to consider for next mesocycle, to go directly from a hip extension full range of motion into a lengthened partial on like an RDL. But it's something, like I said, I'd like to start from week 1 so I can kind of slowly progress it up instead of jumping in intensely into it in the middle of the cycle. So that is where I am with training. And then the last update for me is I'm planning to shadow the N1 practical on Thursday, June 9th, which is the shoulder and arm day. So it's the one with the most complicated patterns that you and I have talked about on the show before, where we basically go into the first day of N1 and like our heads explode because everything is so new and novel. I thought I was going to be shadowing the chest and back, like the torso day on Saturday, but scheduling conflicts came up. So I'm going to try and do Thursday, and should be a good refresher and teach me some new stuff as well along the way.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, that was definitely like the head exploding day. Like I had like the overwhelm was like the feeling. It was like definitely the word. I was like, I'm so overwhelmed.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, the only training update I have is my ab conditioning has reached a peak, like poorness. I had abs in my training yesterday. It's just the simple rectus abdominis, like, you know, cable crunch, seated crunch. I pulled over the fucking bench to set it up. I did 1 warm-up rep and my whole shit locked up.
Oh man.
And like, it was literally like I had like the second smallest amount of weight that I could have on it, and just like the movement, it just completely locked up. And the worst part about it is like after that happens, like you can't just like wait it out and go back because it just like stays locked up. So I'm like, I literally have to just move this bench back now. So I think what I started doing today and what I'm gonna plan to do is like just do isometric stuff like daily to try and accrue just like isometric volume in there until I can take them through flexion, I guess. I don't even know. It's very strange. I literally makes me feel like the most narc motherfucker on planet Earth, that like I cannot contract my abs without them cramping. Or maybe I just have to do a lot of like lengthened stuff, and because it's always happens on like a really shortened type movement.
Yeah.
So maybe I just do like lengthened partial type
That
things.
was
I don't really know.
my suggestion was going to be, what about, because it seems to happen when you bring your torso to your knees or whatever? What happens if you bring your knees to your torso, right? So we're doing more of like a hanging knee raise type thing or a reverse crunch or something along those lines. It may be better for you than creating that like flexion component as much, you know?
Yeah, those are my thoughts. That's what I'm going to have to try and do. But that's the only training update that I have that's worth sharing. And then the last thing I have that is actually really, really cool is my fat loss and muscle gain models are live. So every time that I would post about these on my stories or whatever, I'd get at least a handful of DMs from coaches like, hey, can I buy this from you? And this, what's really funny is that's exactly how my check-in system that I sell now started. Just a tool that I built for my business to better help my clients. Because something that I was finding is you get inquiries or a client starts and you get something like, hey, it's my 40th birthday in 6 weeks and I want to be 180 pounds. Can we do this? And you run some numbers and you're like, I mean, potentially it's a bit of a stretch, but let's see. And then like, let's say in that example, we have to cover, we have 6 weeks, we have to cover like 18 pounds. So like pretty aggressive. And then like 2 weeks in where they need to be doing like 2 pounds per week, 2+ pounds per week. And like, they're not, I'm like, yeah, listen, this isn't going to happen. So what's really, it's an uncomfortable conversation from a coach because you have to be like the voice of reason and like, hey, can we do this? And you're kind of like, no, we can't. But instead of me feeling like a dick saying that, I'm like, well, let's put it in the model and see what that gives us. And then we'd be like, see, like this, the model says this, it's not going to really happen. So it eases the conversation, the discomfort. And two, it really, really helps timeline things too. Cause someone will be like, hey, I'm 25% body fat. I want to be 15. Like, what are we looking at? And I'm like, here we go. We can just run this math. We're looking at 5 months of dieting type of thing, and that's assuming the low rate of gain. So that's really, really cool. There's a muscle gain one as well. I'm really, really pumped about it. And just something that's been cool is as much as I, love having my own clients. I have coaches as clients now with my coaching capabilities container, like just being able to give back to other coaches. I'm like, hey, I have these tools that I use to run my business. Like here, you can buy them. Here's a course on how to use it and you can use it in your business as well. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, you can find that from the Straker Nutrition Co. website or any of my social medias. I have links and everything to it, but I'm pumped to get another product out there for other coaches to use.
I love that, dude. Sounds super valuable. And I love that you keep innovating and providing value. So way to go, man.
Yeah. Thanks, B. Cool. Let's jump in. That's all I had.
All right, cool. So I just have two super short topics to get into like what kind of your main topic was for the day. But these are just kind of two things that have been on my mind that I think are interesting and I think could make for interesting discussions, and would love to hear if anybody has any thoughts on these on their own as well. If you want to throw comments in too. But the first one I want to discuss is making sense of isolation movements that are lengthened overloaded. Because in the model that I follow with my progression system is kind of looking at the difference between short overload movements, regardless of whether they're compound or isolation. You just kind of assume that most isolation movements are short, which they're not. And then you have like these compound lengthen movements. So on one spectrum, you have like the compound lengthen, which are your squats and your RDLs and stuff like that. And then on the short overload spectrum, we have our like rows and our pull downs. Many varieties of curls and tricep movements, lateral raises, things like that. But where we find kind of a hiccup in some of this, in identifying the fatigue cost of a movement and how we might progress that movement, we have these like lengthened overload isolation movements. And examples of these are things like an overhead dumbbell tricep extension. So something like this. It could also be the same idea of like a cross cable tricep extension. So something where it's a lengthened overload, but it's isolated at elbow extension like that. You can see the same thing with like the face away curl or the incline dumbbell curl, where these movements are isolation movements. So you don't think like they're these these things that you need to worry about, the fatigue cost or anything like that. And the only reason that it kind of became forefront in my brain is because, as I've talked about in prior episodes, I progress short overload movements differently than lengthen. So you look at the lengthened compounds and I progress them usually by going like 4-3-2-1-0 RIR or something along those lines. Then for the short overload movements, it's more like, 1-2 RIR, 0-1 RIR, then partials, then reverse drop sets, then stuff like that. Neither of those models seem to fit super well when you're looking at something like a face away curl or like an overhead tricep extension. Like, I don't really want to start that at 4 RIR because it's an isolation movement. Like, the fatigue cost is going to be low. You don't need to start so far away from failure. But at the same time, you feasibly, realistically cannot progress a lengthened movement into partials. So imagine you're sitting there doing like a face away curl and you're like, well, it's not that fatiguing because it's an isolation movement. So let me do some partials. But literally, like, when you get to the bottom, nothing happens because that is where it's overloaded. It's overloaded in the lengthened position. So what do we do with these movements? How do we progress them? And so in my brain, the way that I kind of conceptualized this was to think of them as almost like a hybrid between the short and the lengthened compounds, the short overload isolations and the lengthened compounds, whatever. You guys know what I mean. So what I usually do with those is I start them around 2 or 3 RIR and I progress them as you naturally would, then 1-2 RIR, then 0-1. So by the time we get into this 4th week of training, we're now looking for a progression beyond failure. And so the one that I've kind of settled on for the moment is using it as a rest pause set, which I kind of alluded to in the beginning. So you have this like face away curl or this overhead tricep extension, and you'll do a set to 0 RIR. You'll rest 15 or 20 seconds and you'll go back at it again. And so the way this usually works in application is I'll get 10 to 12 reps on my initial set. I'll rest 15 to 20 seconds and I'll come back and usually get 4 to 5 reps from there, depending on the movement. And so that's a super effective way to almost get like 5 effective reps if you're following an effective reps model. And the reps closest to failure, the 5 closest to failure are going to be producing the most growth or stimulus. Then you do that rest pause set and you're essentially getting the effective reps of an entire set just by resting 15 to 20 seconds and going again. So that's kind of the same model that I would follow 2 or 3 weeks later for like a lengthened compound. So imagine you're doing like a pendulum squat or something and you're like 4 RIR, 3, then 2, then 1, then 0. Well, now you're at week 6 and you've already done 0 RIR. If you can get an extra rep the next week, then you don't need to do anything like a rest pause in my mind to like progress the stimulus. But in theory, something I could see myself doing if I'm still chugging along in week 6 or 7 of a meso is taking something like a hack or a pendulum and maybe doing a rest pause set. It just so happens that it happens 3 weeks earlier when it's one of these lengthened isolation movements. So that's kind of the way that I've made sense of those in my programming, and just figured I'd share that with you guys. Any thoughts on that?
Nothing like concrete. It's like a super high level thought around it. Because when I was reading the note you had here, like, it kind of didn't make sense to me. And then as you were speaking through, I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah. Like, that's a really interesting, consideration. The rest pause, I think, is a fantastic, implementation to land on, because you're going to, generally find yourself being able to get like 3 to 5 extra reps there, especially with the lengthened overload. But it is interesting, and it's something that, because it's lengthened, it doesn't really lend itself as well to like a standard progression model, because it's a lengthened isolation where it's like, pretty much like a single joint thing, where if, when you're progressing like a squat, you're having multiple forces and factors working on each other to where you could have an improvement in your glutes, or an adaptation in the glutes, and maybe not so much in the quads, but this might produce an extra rep or something like that. When you have a single joint exercise, it's like that tricep adaptation didn't happen, like you're not progressing. So it's like there's less variables. So yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. And those are the two. I literally did those two exercises today,
Yeah.
which I like. I love both of them. But yeah.
I do too. Yeah, I think the important thing to take away from that is just that when you look at these lengthened isolations, they're not nearly as fatiguing per unit of stimulus as like a lengthened compound is, but they're also not as forgiving potentially, or they're more fatiguing than like a single joint short overloaded movement. I would almost look at them as fatigue cost as similar to something like a row, because that's like a compound movement, but it's very short overloaded. And this is a isolation movement, but it's lengthened overloaded. It kind of falls in the same fatigue cost spectrum, but it just can't be progressed with partials because of where it fails. So there has to be this kind of alternative approach to that. And so anyway, I thought that was interesting. And then, the other kind of random thought in Bryan's brain that I wanted to relay to you guys is, okay, so how can I frame this up? One of the things that we have focused a lot on in the last 6 to 12 months on this podcast is the notion of rep speed slowing down as you approach failure. So we referenced the Jeff Nippard video, the whole debates between not debates, but the controversies between Lyle and Dr. Mike, where we're like, hey, you should see the last 3 or 4 reps before failure. Your reps should slow down as you fight through the sticking points, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I've been a huge proponent of this too. And now I want to present like an alternative idea. So what if, when you reach that point on a move, actually, let me backtrack a little bit. So you're doing a movement and your reps you're doing, we'll do cable row, because that's the one that sticks out in my mind. You're the first 8 reps of a 12 rep set, you can pretty much get to full range of motion and you don't really have to like grind through anything. The reps just kind of move and you get full range of motion, right? But what if when you get through reps 9, 10, 11, and 12, where you would usually have to like start kind of grinding through the short position and your rep speed would slow significantly? What if you just gave it what you got from the get-go, but as soon as you reach that point where the grind begins to start, you just don't do it. You just stop your range of motion at that point. And so you're still pulling as hard as you can. You're still giving full force from the bottom. It's just, instead of fighting through those last few inches, you just let those last few inches be where they are, and you let your range of motion decrease, kind of like doing partial reps. So it really is a point of beyond failure. It's partial reps. It's just partial reps out of your inability to explode through a point instead of getting to said point and then fighting your way through that point. So my theory is that potentially you're going to get obviously less of a metabolic effect, because you're not fighting through what is that short overload portion of the movement where all the metabolites are accumulating and you're getting that like awful lactic acid buildup in there. But you are essentially still creating a ton of stimulus, because you're not actually you're going to the point of failure and then beyond. Does that make sense? Am I even explaining that well? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do. I have a devil's advocate thought that kind of immediately popped into my head, but yeah, I do understand what you're saying.
Cool. What's your thought?
So I'm probably going to botch this in my efforts to explain it, but there is that, or this concept that you should hopefully be able to pick up on what I'm trying to explain and then tell the listeners exactly what it is. The smaller motor units will like kind of exhaust first, and then like the very end, like your last reserves are like the larger motor units, right? And is my understanding incorrect that like if you are not grinding through those reps, that you will not be recruiting as many of the motor neuron units as possible, because you're purposefully foregoing those grindy rep periods?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that's maybe where like this idea formulated in my head or whatever, because to me, it would seem that by grinding through that last portion, it's mostly like just metabolic accumulation, essentially. And that the largest motor units, like the explosive fast twitch muscle fibers, are going to be engaged primarily upon the initiation of the movement. And they probably aren't working as much as you're grinding to the top of the short position. I mean, it would be almost no different than like looking at the inverse example of the leg extension. So it's like maybe the argument there, I think the argument for grinding through would potentially be like localized hypertrophy, where there was a study done a while ago where they showed that the short position of a leg extension targeted more of the VMO by the kneecap, and the lengthened position of the leg extension targeted more of the portion by the hip of the vastus, I believe, or rec fem probably. But so maybe that would be like the example in the row would be like maybe you're getting a little bit less local hypertrophy bias in a specific portion of the muscle head. But as far as like the motor neurons, my thought would be that if you're giving it all you got from the beginning and then you reach this like stop point, that you're recruiting almost everything you need of the big stuff just by getting to that stop point. And that if that stop point then moves closer and closer and closer to the lengthened position as you get more fatigued, then essentially at that point you're just doing partials. Like when you do partial reps, like lengthened partials in a short overload movement, do you reach the sticking point of the partial and then keep grinding, or do you just kind of hit that sticking point and then you go back down and do another partial?
I will try. I really take it as far as I can with my partials.
So you spend time grinding through the partial?
And well, while I still can, yeah. And then, I mean, the interesting thing with the partials is like, you really can't do very many before the weight's barely coming off the bottom or whatever. Like, especially in the leg extension.
It depends. I would say that
go ahead.
On a row, on a cable row, like Jordan and I were actually talking about this on his podcast, but on a cable row, I can do, man, if I fail at 8 or 10 reps on a cable row, I can do another 6 to 8 reps of partials before it's even, I can still even be bending my arm at that point. Leg extension, it depends where it's overloaded. Again, like if you're getting 90 or 80% of the range of motion on the first rep, then I think that drop off is pretty gradual. It's like, 75, 65, 50, 40, 30. Like I have my leg extension set up on mid-range overload, and I'm still getting 4 to 5 partials when it's on mid-range. So I think if it was on a short overloaded setup, that there's no reason I couldn't get 8-ish partial reps.
7 was the number that I was going to go with. But I mean, that first 1 to 2, you'll still get a pretty good range of motion. And then by rep 3, your ROM's probably down to what, 60% max?
Yeah, I agree. So I would say, I tend to do my partials more like I'm stating in this example, where I tend to just take my partial to the sticking point and then come back down and take it to the sticking point and come back down, versus getting to the sticking point and then trying to fight through said sticking point. And so it was that application of partials that actually made me think of this, because if there is as much or nearly as much benefit in just going to the sticking point and coming back down and letting that sticking point get smaller as you go, instead of spending all this energy and the pain of fighting through the sticking point. I don't know. Like, I would love to see a study on this, of course, but based on what we know from the research and the velocity data that like Eric Helms loves to talk about, he puts velocity stops in on a lot of these studies, where the velocity stop is such that it's like a 3 RIR or something like that. And that's still showing to be very effective. So imagine like if that's effective and you're getting a full range of motion with a velocity stop at 3 RIR, then if that velocity stop then if you just go and you keep doing more reps beyond that point. So maybe it's not like full range of motion reps, but you're getting whatever you can. It seems intuitively that would be an effective approach. But I'm completely just conjecturing here. Like this is the question I would love to have people's input on and see if anyone else has even thought about it in this manner and has any feedback they could provide.
I think like at a, if I were to boil today's episode down to like a single statement, I think that's like what today's episode really is about. Is like it's our conjecture. And I mean, this next part that we're going to go into, it's kind of led by my fears, if I'm being completely honest. But yeah, I love that what you just said, and I genuinely do not know.
Yeah. No, totally. We'll take us into the next part because I think this extreme focus on nuance that I just put into like these things that could be argued matter very little. I think it transitions quite well into your trepidation on the nuance potentially in today's episode.
Yeah. So what kickstarted these thoughts for me is there's a recent episode of the Revive Stronger podcast, or I don't even know if it made it to the podcast or not, but it's on YouTube. I watched it on YouTube, and it's between Kasim and Dr. Mike Israetel, and they're talking. It's basically a deload debate. Basically, Kasim is presenting his case for the N1 style-esque of how they do stimulus swaps for debates, and then Dr. Mike is arguing basically just straight volume intensity deload, more traditional style. They're pretty much arguing polar opposite points, generally around AMPK and mTOR pathways. And I'm watching this, and it's long. It's like an hour and 15 minutes, hour and 30 minutes or something. And what's really interesting is I'm going to speak about this from a couple points. One of them is objectively wrong. I don't know which one. To be completely honest, I do not have a clue. One of them is wrong because they're arguing polar opposite points on paper based on, for the pure science of the word science. One of them is incorrect. That being said, they're both helpful. And I think it's one of these things where, as in chasing optimal, we love to talk about things on paper, argument for the sake of like potentially ego and just being able to say that you are correct. But at the end of the day, like both of these deload, approaches will serve the purpose. And this large kind of revisiting question in my head is, I am not, even though one of them is technically incorrect, I'm not convinced that one or the other will actually lead to more muscle mass over a period of 3, 6, 9 months. And it's been this thing. And then so something I'm kind of going off on the side here. One thing I really try not to do anymore is I never go in the comments. Like the comments section on anything that of like a decent following size, like it's just a cesspool of just negativity. And what's really interesting is I'm looking at this and people are like saying like, no, Kasim's wrong because X, Y, and Z, or Dr. Mike's wrong. Like for all these people in here, like this deload debate is minutia in the grand scheme of things. So I guarantee these people in there arguing about it, like their sleep isn't optimal. Their nutrition's far from optimal. They don't know what their labs look like, right? They're probably walking around with lipids super, super high and all of these things. And stress management's potentially in a really, if we're just speaking about the population at large, even the lifting population, we can make these kind of statements. And I continuously find myself coming back to like, how much does this all matter? Does X translate into 3 pounds more muscle at the end of the year, 2 pounds more muscle at the end of the year, especially when we are talking around natural populations, right? As your lifting career, let's use that term, and training age increases, right? It's like, I always forget this word. I think it's like an asymptomatic, asymptote, I believe is the proper terminology. Asymptote, yeah. Like you continuously approach, 100 but you never reach it because the point, you're reaching the point of not necessarily diminishing returns, but the improvements become basically intangible to monitor as you continue to go. And it's kind of, I was going back through some kind of older pictures of myself from like 2018, or some of the times where, you and I would train together, Bryan. And I've, again, like I briefly mentioned, it is largely directed by fear, but I have the question of like, have I been actually like training non-optimally? I have, it's hard because I weigh so much less than I used to, but I look at some of those like pictures and I'm like, man, I was like 216, 217 there. I'm probably like 16-ish% body fat, where now I'm lean, but I'm like, it's kind of like 25 pounds heavier. And I'm just like, I'm not convinced that I have been doing things, the new way that I've been doing things actually translates to more muscle. And that's just this, I guess, fear that I've had. So what are your thoughts around all of that, Bryan?
Yeah, I mean, you went in a lot of different directions there. From
Let's start at the top.
The deload debate to am I smaller and should I be continuing to train the way I was training? So first off, I think that it's certainly a challenging topic because both of us started training in this different way from such an advanced stage. So the amount of change that you would be able to actually see is so small. It's also like, man, you can say that you were 216 at 16% body fat, but for all we know, you may have been 22% body fat, or like we don't exactly know because we were just training and eating. It's like such madmen. It's a bit different. And I think one of the pieces of this argument that I always come back to is, well, two pieces, but longevity and sustainability. And, if I was still training the way that, even aside from CrossFit and like kipping movements and stuff like that, even Olympic lifting, take Olympic lifting out. If I was still training with deadlifts and squats and bench presses as like the primary tools to develop my body, I think that I would be in a lot of pain right now and lack a lot of enjoyment in the training that I was doing. So I think that that's one factor for sure. And then I always also think about something that Cass said on, I think it was either McConey or Abel's podcast, where he was like, let's just assume that these, iliac lat and lumbar lat and like these super specific lat movements, let's just assume that they don't actually train the lat any better than, your common movements that people do. Well, you're still doing the movement, like you're still doing a pull. You're still doing elbow flexion and humeral depression and scap retraction and like all of these different things. So even if that one arm iliac pull down is not necessarily targeting your iliac better than something else, it's still training your back effectively. So like, what's the opportunity cost of not doing it? You're still getting a stimulus to your back as you would with any other pull down type movement. So it would be really hard to argue that you're losing muscle by doing that movement. I think, you could make the argument that it's the same as doing another pull down and that you're at the same place because of that. But I couldn't really say very confidently that, I changed out my bench presses to press arounds and my wide grip pull downs to iliac pull downs. And now somehow my back and chest have shrunk and I've lost muscle there. You know what I mean? So I think just when you look at it from that way, like the opportunity cost is low. And then you look at the longevity and sustainability piece of all the stuff we've talked about since we started doing the N1 stuff, like lining up joint angles with fiber lines and creating, lines with the cable through our extremities to create, more gentle and lines of pull for different movements. And the fact that, when I look at my body now and there's no elbow pain, there's no knee pain, there's no shoulder pain, there's none of these things. And that there's this excitement around training. So I there's like the physiological side of it of, maybe it just focuses on longevity and sustainability and health. But then there's the mental side of it, which, you talk about a lot, that you become this like super cognitive, cerebral trainee. Maybe then it's not out of necessity, like to use your argument, maybe you don't need to do these things, but maybe these things help you stay like psychologically engaged and interested in the training that you're doing. So that would be like kind of my big picture view introduction. And then I think we can get into the weeds and address the deload stuff a little more specifically if you want, but those are initial thoughts for me.
No, I really, really like that because you helped kind of extract my bigger thoughts into more tangible pieces. And we have talked about this before, but the sustainability and the joint integrity thing, 100%, right? That is a really, really big one that I just didn't cover. I also really like that you brought up the joint angles and stuff. That's another one, especially like arms. Training arms has probably been one of the biggest, arms and delts, one of the biggest like takeaways from a lot of the N1 principles and stuff like that, because it's like the word efficiency really comes to mind, especially with something like the overhead tricep extension, that lengthened one. A really great use case is like right now I'm not doing a lot of arms, right? From a physique development standpoint, like my arms are probably one of the better body parts that I have. Just don't need that much extra, time dedicated to them. So I really only do like that one tricep exercise, but it's a lengthened overload. You load it up, you do a couple sets, like you can really get a lot of effective volume in there. Where if I didn't know anything about like a lengthened versus shortened, I might do like a traditional rope, press down, and then like a reverse grip press down, or who knows the crazy things that people do where you have like 4 different tricep exercises and you don't get as good of a stimulus as just doing one really, really well selected and executed tricep exercise. I was more so thinking about it from like your larger muscle groups, I guess it's something you said was really, really good is as we have gotten into this more later in our training careers where we just have our margins for success, or not even margins, the amount of green in front of us for how much progress there is left to be made is significantly smaller. I think if someone found a lot of these things much earlier, that magnitude of effect is going to be gargantuan. But my kind of lasting thought, or that fear that came up, is back when I was a member at your gym and I really didn't know that much about training. Like I just showed up every day and tried as hard as I could. And that got me kind of exactly where I am now. And I'm just not convinced that like all this new knowledge that I have actually translates to like more muscle mass. And that I think is like the point that I was trying to work myself through.
Yeah, I mean, that's like totally possible. And it's something I struggle with too. I mean, it's like I'm not at this point going to go back to training that way for the reasons that I said. Like there's a lot to be said for volume and effort. And one thing that we had when we did CrossFit and we were training in our early days, there was no shortage of volume and there was no shortage of effort. And if you just do a lot of that shit and you eat a lot of food, you don't get yourself completely overtrained because you're at least eating enough, right? And you're doing a decent amount of sleep and you're young, so your body's regenerating super fast and all these things. You'll make gains. Like, you'll absolutely make gains. It's possible too that like, you and I have discussed how through Olympic lifting and deadlifting a lot, we got these just like massive traps, like the whole trap system, not just upper traps, although those are the most prominent, but we got this massive trap system throughout our entire upper backs. And then we got a bunch of erectors that while they may have been mostly inflammation, they were much larger, whether they were inflamed or just trained all the time or both. The fact that we had these like big, massive upper back trap systems and erectors, it made us look more massive. Like you almost look more like gorilla-like when you have that structure in your body. And that is one thing that we both have discussed on air and off air, that Olympic lifting constantly gave us that kind of gorilla-like appearance in the upper traps and upper back area. So, it could certainly be argued that maybe we gave up a little bit of mass in those areas to focus potentially on developing our legs and adding mass in other places. And so you again look at this like where we were 6 years ago, 7 years ago to where we are now. And so we look at our legs specifically because that's the one area where maybe we can see change, because that was an area that we felt both were underdeveloped and underutilized in the CrossFit days, understimulated in the proper ways. And so maybe we made that decision that, hey, we're willing to give up some of this like central fatigue that we're carrying around all the time and this upper back muscle mass for the sake of being smarter, carrying less fatigue, being more mentally acute, and being able to actually develop our legs in potentially what I would say is a tangible manner. Like maybe we don't see these changes on our upper body as much because that was our milkshake anyways. But on the areas that we could bring up, we actually do see that they were brought up.
I really, really like that. Yeah. And I mean, we've talked about it so much on the podcast. The leg development is night and day for the both of us. And I really liked, you brought up like two terms that I liked: opportunity cost and trade-off, because some of my thinking of what I talked about or was presenting is a little bit of like having my cake and eat it too. But what we do not have now is the constant inflammation, the feeling run down a lot, poor sleep. Like we were pretty jacked and I was, 25 pounds heavier. I also had a lot of net negatives in my life too that I no longer do. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because my thought process, I was trying to like externalize that and not bring those negatives along with those positives of when we had huge spinal erectors and really jacked rhomboids and stuff like that. My body also felt like a hot fucking dumpster fire every single day. So it's a really, really good, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And then the deload stuff, like we didn't even really touch on the deload aside from just using it as a jumping off point to like the rest of the conversation here. But, you mentioned the YouTube comments, and it's funny timing because Dave and Abel and I were actually just yesterday having a convo in our WhatsApp group about specifically, where was I just going with that? Why did I just get so distracted? About YouTube comments. And Abel was saying that it's like he's like a cesspool and he turns them off because they like really like fire him up, And Dave was like, oh really? Because I actually really like them. I think there's a lot of value to be found in there, and I think it's a bit of mix of both. But I will say that I do find value in there. I actually think there's a lot of comments where some really smart guy who has either a degree or like a really acute mind for science will come in and drop just like 3 paragraphs of like, evidence supported things with citations, and you're just reading through it and you're like, oh man, I'm so glad I read these comments right now. And then going back to that exact video with the deload debate, there was one comment in there where a guy was like, yeah, I used to do it, Dr. Mike's way and it was cool. And then I went and I started doing it Kassem's way, and it just, I feel subjectively like I do get better pumps and that I feel more recovered doing it. So I've been doing it Kassem's way, for a year, and like I just prefer it this way. So you had a lot of those comments too, and like where people are very civil and they're just like, hey, this is my opinion, here's why, and it creates some decent conversation in there. And then of course you have the trolls and the people that are just negative, and the people with, a profile with no picture and all that sort of stuff. But But I did think it was interesting and for the most part pretty civil. And I think that as I was reading through the comments, the same thought just kept going through my brain as it did before I even began the comments, which was everyone's got to find the way to deload that's best for them. And while universally we may have like an AMPK response that is pretty standard across humans because we're close enough in genetic makeup that it should probably be the same AMPK response. They both brought up really good points, and so while, like you said, objectively one of them is wrong, I also think that there's a lot of gray in there. So like one of the things that Kasim kept saying is that it's not like you're going into these change of stimulus deloads and you're just going full force like RPE 10 on everything right off the bat. Like, in fact, his like 8x8 Garanda method, there's only one failure point. So you have 7 sets that are sub failure. You're also doing those with short overload movements, so they're not as fatiguing. There's like these other things. So even when you go beyond just like, is it having the AMPK effect that we want, or is it not? Like, is it resensitizing us to mTOR, or is it not type thing? I don't know. Like it's probably a gray area somewhere in between, and it depends how you implement the Kasim style deload and how you implement the Dr. Mike deload. And then there's totally this third option, which is like, you don't have to do it like either of them. You can just do your own deload. Like when Helms came on our podcast and he was like, yeah, you know how I deload? I reduce my training from 5 times a week to 3 times a week, and I do 1 set to absolute failure on every movement. Cool. You reduced frequency and you reduced volume. That's 2 out of the 3. You did awesome. You know what I mean? And so for me, like, that's kind of how I tend to do it. Like, frequency deloads mostly, reduce a little bit of volume, reduce a little bit of intensity, but mostly I just reduce frequency and then kind of work my way back up. So it just, like, as I was listening to that debate, the thought in my brain just kept reoccurring. That's like, man, if you just do less than you were doing before, you're going to facilitate recovery. So however the fuck you decide that you want to do less than you were doing the prior week, go have at it. Like, reduce fatigue, bro, and then get back to training, because that's where most of the gains are going to be made anyways.
Yeah, I think, again, just a perfect summary by you of my exact thoughts. And yeah, I mean, you really just hit the nail on the head. It's absolutely fantastic. Sweet. Like, at the end of the day, you just need to deload to reduce fatigue, pretty much, and increase recovery. Yeah. And the last thing I will add there, and then I don't think I have anything else for this episode, is I'm sure, again, with anything, when you have like these debates and stuff, you're talking about populations of people, right? A mean, an average of people. You, listener who's listening right now, you may find yourself on the fringe of someone who's more genetically conducive towards AMPK or mTOR. So you might find that one works significantly better for you than the other, and then someone could find themselves on the complete opposite end. So I think, like with everything always has to come back to individualizing it for yourself and finding out which maybe fits into your lifestyle better. Maybe you do care. You're like, hey, maybe I will sacrifice 0.001% of my total genetic capacity of muscle mass so that I can be in a better cardiovascular standpoint. That trade-off can come from values and things in your life as well. So at the end of the day, that's what it always comes back to.
I'll also say, and maybe I shouldn't even say this, but I feel like Dr. Mike has kind of made it obvious that like he's in this for the short term. Like, he's doing the assisted thing, the special sports supplements. And he's even said that like he wants to get as much as he can while he can, and that in 5 years from now, he probably won't even be bodybuilding anymore. So I think that when you look at like everything Mike says is like optimality for the moment. And I think that sometimes Cass is like, hey, let's look at optimality for like the rest of life as well.
Yeah. And it really comes down to like, the argument, especially when it comes to like science and research, like what is the argument? Is the argument only peak muscle mass and nothing else? It's important for that context to come in, because that could change how things are argued. So yeah, I get it.
Cool. Well, that's all I got.
Yeah, same. So as always, guys, thanks for listening. Especially this episode, just a little bit more of, I guess, me projecting, sharing some fears, and then Bryan doing a really good job of breaking them down and showing me my fallacies and in my thought process. So I feel better. This podcast was almost kind of like therapy for me. So Bryan, I appreciate it.
Yeah,
And then
man.
any listeners out there, guys, if this hit home for you, if this was helpful, I really hope it was. So as always, Bryan and I will talk to you next week.